by our friends in Copenhagen and Florence School. And as you can see, we also introduced a hashtag because yesterday's roundtable caused a lot of interesting comments and discussions. So if you want to continue those discussions after this live session, please use this hashtag. So why are we here today? Well, at the last Copenhagen Infrastructure Forum organized by European Commission with all the stakeholders, the conclusions nicely invited our two schools to continue the debate and to also bring together the stakeholders, the regulators, and the academic view on where are we with our thinking on innovation related to networks. And we already organized one roundtable yesterday. You can look at the recording. And yesterday we said, okay, part of innovation is incentives, right? Regulatory incentives. So that plays definitely a role in networks. We also opened it up and we said there is more to innovation than funding, financing, incentives. It's also about creating the right institutional environment. And Touraj made a very nice introduction to what academics call the ecology of innovation. And we had a good discussion on that. Today we pick up where we left yesterday. Today we say, okay, maybe there is even more to innovation of networks. Maybe sometimes regulation rules are preventing us from testing out new things. So maybe regulation also need to allow for experimentation, and experimentation often means maybe deviating from the current set of rules we have. And that's really what we will dive in today. And I must say that on the topic of yesterday, there is much more academic literature than on the topic of today. So today we are even more dependent on our experts here. And we're very happy to have three regulators that have a lot of experience. We have Neil Barnes for Ofgem, we have Luca for the Italian regulator, and we have Luc from the Netherlands. And you will notice that these are three countries, three regulators that really take this at heart and have not only already some experience, but also try to adapt from their learnings. And then very happy also we have Henriette with us. Henriette has been very kind in helping us organize these roundtables. So it is only normal that she's also here now today, and I hope, especially towards the end, she will help us conclude this series of two roundtables and maybe share a bit what are her main takeaways to take to the office at DG Energy, or probably the online version for now. Okay, so now you know who we are, why we are here. We already actually started to engage with several of you because we had drafted two papers, Florence School and Copenhagen, and you can definitely have a look at that paper, but there is a strong disclaimer. This is really just a draft to kick off discussions, and that's why we also introduce that paper today, and that's the role of Tim in this case. And we will use everything we discuss here today to further refine the paper, and then a more final version will be taken to the next Copenhagen Forum and hopefully then further inspire the debate. Okay, Tim, please introduce us to the first topic of discussion.
Thank you, Leo. So the energy sector is highly regulated. This has good reasons. I mean, it's a complex system. You need coordination, you need roles and responsibilities to make it work. At the same time, it's also essential energy for our society. Therefore, we need a lot of regulation. But at the same time, regulation can somehow unjustifiably block new innovation because it can take a lot of time to adjust, to rewrite, to reject regulations when the context is changing. So regulators, they need to be inventive in order to find ways to allow these new innovations without somehow disrupt the status quo, or at least what is in place. And with the Florence School and also with Copenhagen School of Infrastructure, we look deeper into several ways that regulators can do so. So to be more responsive, dynamic with their regulation in order to allow for innovation. So first we found 3 approaches, but after already some input, we enlarged it to 4 approaches. So a first way to allow for innovation would be waivers. So waivers are strictly defined activities or actors which somehow are exempt from certain regulations. And everyone who somehow complies with that definition in terms of act or activity is then does not have to take the burden of that regulation. So examples which we found in the European context are, for example, balanced responsibility for renewables. So at the beginning, renewable generation, they had a waiver from balanced responsibility because that would be a strong burden for them. Another example is, for example, aggregation. So it could be that some rules, for example, in the balancing codes, block aggregators in order to somehow integrate or to compete in these markets. So they could be waived from certain requirements to allow them to enter. A third example, which we gave in the paper, is our energy communities. So energy communities, if they really supply energy to end consumers, they should somehow comply with all supplier requirements. But there's very heavy requirements. So therefore, they might be waived from certain supplier requirements. So this is a first way of doing it. A second way of allowing for innovation would be an exemption procedure. So an exemption procedure is hard-coded in existing regulation. So it's strictly defined activity or actor, which can be exempt from a certain rule. But the difference with waivers is that with exemption procedure, the innovator or the person who wants to get this exemption or activity should really hand in a file with the regulator. And this regulator should then study the file and see whether this particular, let's say, one actor or one activity can then does comply with the definition and can be granted this exemption. So the example we found in the European context is that of merchant interconnectors. So normally big infrastructure or transmission lines between two countries would be built by the TSO. But since already the second energy package in 2003, the regulation allows also for third parties to step in and to build out these infrastructures if they comply with certain definitions. And if they do, if they are granted this exemption, they can build their line and can be exempt from, for example, rules around congestion income, around third-party access, and so forth. So this is a way to somehow introduce new players in this business, which is normally done by TSOs. A third example, and this is one which was not included in the paper, is a regulatory pilot. So a regulatory pilot is really a sort of an experiment which has been designed or guided by the regulator and often engages with network companies, with regulated network companies. So somehow the activity or actor is decided by the regulator. There is a predefined exemption or deviation from the rules. And the way that this exemption is granted is inherent into the experiment. An example of a regulatory pilot could be, for example, in Italy, they did allow when building up charging stations for a DSO to be opening this charging station, and then they were exempt or they had a sort of special tariff, and therefore they could do this new task, which was formerly not possible. But also other parties could then try to build up these charging stations. But this was kind of really an experiment designed by regulators. So regulators were the initiative taker. Regulatory sandboxes are a bit different than pilots because in this case, it is really the regulator who opens the door for other parties to please come to us, tell us which kind of exemption you would want, and then we will study it. And it's really broader in the sense that if you somehow comply with the requirements of this is an actor which can enter the sandbox, okay, you can send in your file. And then together with the regulator or the other involved, let's say, administrator, you can think, okay, which kind of rule of a broad set of rules we really need to be exempt from in order to let this innovation fly. So this is more, let's say, innovator-led type of experiments. And this is a case-by-case assessment by the regulator. So important to see is that these different approaches, they also require different efforts or specializations from the regulator, because of course, the regulators need to be sure that what they're doing is actually not somehow threatening the consumer protection, the safety of the system. So somehow there is a lot of regulatory effort which is being needed and specialization, and it depends also on the type of experiment you want to do. Leo, the next slide. So I can go a bit deeper into these sandbox approaches or pilot approaches in the different countries of the regulators of whom we have in the debate today. So in Italy in 2010, the regulator or there was a call for an experiment which allowed charging station operator or building up charging stations for electrical vehicles. So they gave a call, or DSOs could perform it, or a third party could set up the charging station, having a license for a particular area, or a third party could set it up and be competing in a certain area, so not an exclusive license. So they had 3 business models, and they allowed parties to somehow step into these pilots. And then after these 4 years of experimentation, they would have seen which type of business model is actually the one we would like to pursue, because at that time it was not clear who should be actually operating this charging station. So this was really a kind of a designed experiment from the regulator, but it did not only engage with regulated entities such as the DSO, but also third parties. So it's really on the line between what is a regulatory pilot, what is a regulatory sandbox, but it's very interesting experience where there were a lot of lessons to be learned. The Netherlands in 2015 or 2014, there was a ministerial decree which was called experimentation in the electricity law, if I would translate it. And in that decree, it was said that communities and homeowner associations could send in a file to the ministry to be exempt from certain rules in the electricity law. And in that decree, it was listed that they could be exempt from, let's say, 5 or 6 articles. And they could then choose which articles they want to be exempt from. And together with the ministry and the regulator, they could somehow discuss and then be granted these exemptions for about 10 years, which is quite long. So the ministry was here the leading party, the regulator was giving advice, and then of course monitoring the experiments. There were a total of 18 of these experiments granted this sandbox out of a total of 80, because there was a cap. It was said that every year we can only allow 20 new projects to not give too much burden on the regulator. In Great Britain, I would say it was also a sandbox was set up in 2017. It was the sandbox which most complies with, let's say, the standard definition of a sandbox. It was really open. So it was said like, if you comply with very broad eligibility criteria, you can apply for a sandbox, and you can really choose out of a certain amount of regulations which articles you want to be exempt from. And if the regulator says, okay, we want to do this, then you were given your sandbox. And these exemptions were given for 2 years. A total of 7 sandbox were granted out of 67 applicants in 2 calls. So this is quite important also. And really the parties who were granted the sandbox were very heterogeneous, from new small energy communities to big companies like EDF to established suppliers in GB. So as you can see, the implementation on these regulatory pilots and sandboxes has been done very different in these countries. So Leo, now over back to you.
Thank you, Tim. So, of course, our experts will tell you much more details about these different experiences. But before we let them talk, based on the rough high-level introduction by Tim, if we would ask you today to vote and on which of these approaches you think is most interesting, which one would you vote for? Which one do you prefer spontaneously after this high-level introduction? Do you think the waiver system works best because it's easier and you don't have to do all these procedures? Do you think these more very specific procedures, exemption procedures, are the best? Or the Italian pilot scheme, or the Dutch sandbox, or the Great Britain sandbox? So this is the options you have. And we will now launch a poll to see. By the way, again, very happy to see that there is 141 people live here. So it's a relevant sample we are taking here of opinions. And I also saw that you're already putting questions in the question box, which I will definitely pick up after giving the panelists a first chance to give a reaction to the polling. So let's see what you're going to vote. If we force you to choose, what is it? Okay, so Neil, as you are currently most popular, why don't you start? How happy are you with your own experience even? and maybe what are some of the changes you're doing?
I think sort of happy and unhappy in equal measure. I think it was really important for us to just get a service out there in the market, and really it's been very, very helpful in trying to help us understand what it is people were trying to do in terms of innovation in business models and products and services, and it's really improved our understanding of what is going on in the market. I would say it hasn't led to as many new developments, trials as we would have hoped in advance. So I think there's a lot of learning about what it was that innovators actually need from this sort of service, hence why we're in the process of evolving the sandbox offering that we started 2 or 3 years ago. But I think in some ways it was always going to be an iterative process like that. And it was only really by launching this service that we started to hear from people and have the sorts of interactions whereby we learn what it is that companies want. I think some really good insights, perhaps not surprising with hindsight, but a lot of what firms actually wanted from us was clarity over what the rules do mean and don't mean. So the fact that we only granted 7 sandboxes out of 60 or 70 doesn't mean we rejected the others. It turned out they didn't actually need it. What they really needed from us was the confidence that what they were doing wasn't going to be breaking the law or breaking regulatory rules. But there were plenty of other learnings, including just the time scales. I think a lot of firms, they don't want to run trials. They've got a good idea. They want to launch it live into the market and let the market decide. So the fact that we were offering only a 2-year period probably was quite a constraint. And I see that our Dutch colleagues have got a much longer window there. So again, that's something we're looking at. Obviously, the longer you give some form of flexibility, the more that can bring into play concerns about discrimination and competition and some of those other things. But I think actually in the case of the first case we granted, we've extended the time period given. So I think that's definitely something we could play on. But to be honest, I don't know enough about the detail of some of the other schemes to know what the strengths and weaknesses of those are. But we are, really keen to learn and, I say, keep adapting, keep evolving in the light of what we're hearing from the firms that come to us, but also from what else is happening around Europe and the world.
Neil, thank you for your open and honest experience sharing. So, Luke, can you give us a similar view? I mean, how happy are you with your experience? And when you look at GB or Italy, what is maybe some inspiration you take from there?
Yeah, so actually the option that I was missing a bit was the other, and that would be the utopian way of having I think, a regulatory sandbox. I think that and actually the scheme just a few slides back summarized it pretty good. Is that from my point of view, I think the more flexibility, the better. So that means that the scope, for example, for the ones who could the ones that can apply for a certain sandbox should be open as much as possible, and I also think that should be the case in terms of the timeline of the experiment, etc. So I think flexibility is most important, because innovation, and this is about innovation, it can go every way, and that means also in terms of what is the extent of the legal scope of exemptions. That's also an important aspect. I think, of course, in the Netherlands, with our sandboxes from 2015 to 2018. We've made a very good step already. And also the ministry is working on a new scheme which actually makes the scope a lot broader. So, for example, grid operators will be able to apply for sandbox experiments. The scope of the legal framework is being broadened. So I think that those are good developments. Yeah, Neil already addressed the length of the exemptions. From our experience, what we have seen is that it is important to have a sufficiently long timeline, and that's also because in many cases there are certain upfront investments, and especially for example communities or homeowner associations, they do need some time to recoup their investment. So that's I think one of the main reasons why we choose the default of 10 years. Yeah, so that's probably it for now.
Thank you, Luc. That's a perfect first reaction. I'll come back to some of the details later. But first, I would like to know from Luca. And I also saw, Luca, just so you know, on the chat, we already had somebody asking, what do these pilots really mean? So can you please tell us a bit more, Luca?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. Yes, I want to start from the chat. There is an interesting question from Klaus Kubecko, from the Austrian Technology Institute, I suppose, says what sandbox are, and he suggests, are they close to real life simulation? This for me is extremely important. In our experience, Italian experience, starting from 2010 and evolving over time, the main topic was that regulatory experimentation must be in real life. We said in 2010, real networks, real currents, real customers. Nonetheless, the way of organizing, launching, and selecting pilots changed over time. So the example that Tim inserted in the table is referred to 2010. And at that time, we thought especially of the idea of local pilot project. We had three most important series of pilot projects. One was about charging station, not only of DSO, but also third party. Let me say here that an important topic that is also quoted in a question from Mr. Kloiser, it was about remuneration. In such a case, charging station owned by DSOs, I say this was before Directive 94 of 2014. Then the DSO model is no longer admitted, at least in Italy. However, at that time, the remuneration of DSO was not extended to charging station, but there was a clear separation between the distribution activity remunerated via RAB and WACC and charging station activity where the remuneration was not RAB-based. But I said, not only this, but we had other projects, smart grid for DSO and storage for TSO. Also in these cases, the main idea was I ask network operators to do something more. And for this, I don't feel comfortable with the idea of exemptions. It was not exemption, it was something more, not something less. In change, we as regulator wanted that all results at technical level are to be published and disseminated. For instance, this was very important for storage because the very first experience led by the TSO, again, before the new directive, were fully disseminated and many workshops have been done, very participated, and market players now have a lot of materials useful for them. This was, don't want to take too much time, but just a word. This was the experience in the very, let's say, tense years. Nowadays, we are moving in a different concept that is what we call pilot regulation instead of pilot projects. Pilot regulation are not closed to a local area. They are system-wide. And the case of aggregation virtual units that is quoted in the paper, in the draft paper, is a case of pilot regulation because there is no selection. There is a pilot rule that is inherently time limited and must evolve in ordinary rule, but is not only a waiver. Is not only a waiver. Is something more than ordinary. And many actors, this is not only on the infrastructure side, but also, especially on the market side, can participate. And they also have to share results in a transparent way. So we moved, I close, from pilot projects, and what is clearly stated here about Italy was a pilot project, not the only one, to pilot regulation. That is a much advanced idea that we are going on in these years. Thank you.
Thank you, Luca. I think that was very clarifying to have your first reactions. Could I come back to a few points? So I already heard that you're somewhat aligned on saying, okay, maybe the 2 years in GB was a bit short. So on the number of years there, Neil was already thinking to go up. I heard also Luke saying something interesting, that on the DSOs, they were first not part of it, but they can now be part of it. So then I'm asking back to Neil, is that something you're also considering? I also see the difference between the role of the ministry and the regulator, right? How that Luke some refer to, but can you also comment on that, Neil? And then Luca, is the ministry also involved in your case? If yes, how? And yeah, maybe let's start with that, because these are clear differences. So Neil.
So in our case, the regulatory sandbox was very much a regulatory initiative, and in some ways that enabled us to move forward it quicker. I think one of the constraints that we found with our sandbox was that actually oftentimes the rules that firms needed flexibility from didn't sit within regulation that Ofgem controlled. You know, it sometimes sat up in legislation, obviously the ministry controls, or actually down in the weeds of industry codes and agreements, which were again outside the scope of the sandbox. So one of the things we've done to evolve the sandbox is actually to include some of those lower level industry codes and rules, and work with various industry bodies to enable that, using the Ofgem sandbox as the sort of the front door to that, in case people need multiple exemptions or waivers or whatever is within the sandbox. What we can't do, obviously, as regulator is change some of the wider legislative framework. But in many ways, the lessons we learn from the sandbox really help inform the discussion with government about ways in which we might need to change legislation or regulation permanently going forward to make the market arrangements fit for the future.
Okay, and also, can you react to the point Luca made? Because I like what he said. He said it's more than about giving exemptions, in at least in the case of Italy. Sometimes it's about putting additional requirements on them, like you're allowed to do your pilot or your sandbox, but you need to share, and there is transparency so that others can learn from it. Have you also gone down that line, or?
Yes,
to a degree, I think. Oh, sorry.
No, Neil, go on, go ahead.
I think in an ideal world, absolutely, firms would be able to share what they've learned. I think we've been reasonably open there because we didn't want to deter firms from doing some of these innovative pilots, tests, experiments for fear that they might just have to share the commercially sensitive knowledge at the end of it. So I think we are, I think, on a case-by-case basis, seeing what can be shared and what is useful in relation to the specifics of the case. I think in terms of what rules we've been willing to show flexibility on, absolutely, we've been as transparent as we can there, so we can signal to the market that that's something that others are able to come and look for.
Yeah. Okay. And DSOs, is that also on the table to consider them to be part of this, or?
Yeah. So the scope of our sandbox was, sector-wide. In the event, perhaps understandably, a lot of the focus has been on the consumer-facing, the retail market, partly because we've already got innovation incentives in place on network companies and reasonably well-established processes. So the innovative bit of the sandbox was getting into the competitive bit of the market. But in theory, and some of the sandbox cases have involved retailers, but also networks within that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sure, Luca, please come in.
Let me say a short thing about the power, the legal powers. We did both initial pilot projects and subsequent regulatory pilots on our own, on our own powers, without any consent or in the independency of the regulator.
Okay.
Not only, we even used the tariff system to fund partly these kind of projects. I must underline, following your question to Neil, that is very different if actors are only grid operators, or they are both grid operators and, let's say, market players or third parties in larger sense. So the pilot regulation, the new idea that we are following now, are going towards the involvement of market parties. And here, the problem of sandboxes, experimentation, is discrimination among operators. Can we favor too much? Are we aware that we could, and we don't want, to favor too much some operators in respect of others? This is a big point. This is a big point. On the other side, there is the consumer protection. Are we sure that our pilot project or pilot regulation don't harm consumers? So if there is an exemption or a waiver, is the rule waived unuseful, or the rationale behind that norm is to be is important also for these customers, real customer, or these operators? This is the tricky point of experimentations.
Okay, thank you. Luke, do you want to come in now? If not, I will. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so just to add shortly on Luca, because I totally share his thoughts. What we have seen in the Netherlands with many experiments is that, on the one hand, what Neil said is that many initiatives didn't even need an exemption or a pilot project or a sandbox, because what they wanted was actually allowed within the regulation or legislation. And also what Luca said, it is very important that regulators, or perhaps the ministry, that at least someone is assessing the experiment at the case-by-case manner, because if there is a negative impact, then you want to safeguard it, of course. And what we did see in the Netherlands very often was that an experiment mainly was about shifting part of the cost or certain bills to other parties. And that, for us, is not a very innovative way that we think will succeed in the long run.
Yeah, Thank you, Luke. I was already looking at several questions in the question box, and there is one that I see coming up more than once, which is these sandboxes, these pilots. That's all very nice, but it looks more like distribution network related, retail related, customer related. So what does that mean for if we go to the bigger infrastructures, right? Because when we go back to this slide of Tim, we have that exemption procedure he referred to for interconnectors. You know that we are having new type of discussions on innovation, power to gas, other type of large infrastructures. So do you see any of these tools, approaches we have to regulatory experimentation to be useful also in that other context of larger infrastructures? And then I'm also already getting closer to Henriette and what the EU is currently doing with the 10E revision, right? So should they pick up any on those ideas in that context?
Yes. What I would say to this first poll is that from the Commission side, we are very interested and we are currently looking into different approaches. But as have been mentioned here as well, I think that which tool to apply also depend on the type of activity or project. What is the goal of this exercise? Who is targeted? Is it the TSO, DSOs, suppliers, communities? It requires a little bit different approach. And in the Commission, we are generally very positive to increase the uptake of innovation and innovative elements in the energy system. And we work a lot on incentives, like with DG Climate, on the Innovation Fund, for example. But on regulatory experimentation, I think it's also important to keep in mind not to distort competition too much by giving some long-term advantages only to some actors and market players. So it's important to us to strike the right balance between stimulating innovation on one side and to ensure a level playing field on the other hand. So
yeah. And Luke already gave the example of distribution tariffs, right? That it should not be just about, but I guess in other contexts you could have other concerns. Thank you, Henriette. Do the others want to come in on this one? Because we've been talking a lot about this regulatory pilot and sandbox, but any experience with waivers or exemption procedures? Is that something that is not so interesting for you?
To whom?
Anyone.
May
Luca.
I say one thing?
Sure. Go ahead, Luca.
First, it's true, in my view, that sandboxes is a matter much more related to final market, especially retail level, and third party behind the meter involvement than to large infrastructure. DSO are in the middle somehow. What I want to say is that we are now we have launched a consultation for the gas sector, especially, to realize some pilot project or sandboxes for cross-sector integration, electricity, gas, but the decision has not been taken yet, also due to emergency. The consultation is public and is also prolonged, it seems to me. Last, there is a question about funding. And yes, substantially, regulatory pilot regulation or pilot project are funded through the tariff system without using other public resources. But of course, they are rather limited in size, and therefore the impact on tariff is extremely neglectable. On the other side, when I say before to stay close on the customer protection, avoiding that sandboxes can harm customers, I also refer to the tariff paid by the customers. So we don't want to discriminate customers paying less. Some customers pay less and other than normal. So this is a very important issue, at least in Italy, where the tariff system is unique at national level. So we cannot introduce tariff exemptions on the customer side.
Okay. Thank you, Luca. Neil wants to come in, and I think Tim also wants to make a point after Neil, right? Please,
So
Neil.
we hit on a really important point here about sandboxes, is that they do involve some really difficult decisions for regulators, particularly around, in essence, you are necessarily discriminating in favor of the company that you're giving the sandbox to. Therefore, it's always more comfortable if that is somehow limited either in geography or number of customers or time. That makes you more comfortable that the potential effects on competition more widely are smaller, but recognizing that below a certain scale, actually you might not be able to help. We've been really clear that the sandbox shouldn't be about enabling firms to avoid paying their fair share of costs. So it's not been about allowing firms not to pay certain charges. That's not been on the table. And we've also been really clear that in the context of sandbox, firms absolutely still need to treat their customers fairly. The context might be slightly different, but that's really fundamental. And that what they're doing shouldn't jeopardize the proper functioning of the system, the integrity of the system. But it does put regulators in a difficult place. But the alternative is either this stuff doesn't happen, or you focus on changing the overall regulatory framework, which takes time. It's hard to get the evidence if no one's trialed it, practiced it in the first place. So I think it's it's sort of a necessary step on the journey. But for anyone thinking of any other regulators thinking of this, yeah, it's not straightforward, but I'd say it's well worth. I think the benefits vastly outweigh the costs in terms of regulatory effort.
Thank you, Neil. I'm giving you the floor, Tim, to close this one and immediately also introduce the next topic, because we don't want to miss out on the next topic, right?
Yeah. So thank you, Leo. Yeah, very shortly, this sector coupling seems to be a new area to do sort of experimentation. It's interesting to hear from Luca that in Italy, they're already expanding to gas type of projects. I also know in Netherlands, they do include the gas legislation in their new approach. And I also draw a bit the parallel with what have been done in Italy before in terms of, for example, the operation of batteries by TSOs, which was also this type of technology which could be operated by the market or could be operated by the system operator. And they did do an experiment to see how it works. So therefore, this kind of regulatory pilot could be a way to do it, or this sandbox, which does, let's say, spread over the different energy carriers. But it seems to be very interesting, and it might be a bit bigger scale than the peer-to-peer or tariff changes or supplier communities we see now in most of these sandbox approaches. So, but we can move on to the second poll. So we saw this very interesting paper from Acer and SEER. It's the bridge beyond 2025. We already discussed it. Actually, it came up yesterday also in the debate. And what the regulators say is that, okay, we see different member states doing experimentation with sandboxes or with other kind of approaches, but how to somehow Europeanize this, or do we need to harmonize this? Does it make sense to replicate certain experiments in different contexts? Maybe it does, maybe not. So therefore, also open for us to discuss what can we do at European level to somehow streamline this? There's a balance between innovation, experimentation, and harmonization, level playing field at the other side. Over to you again, Leo.
Yes, and soon I will ask Henriette, because you will first vote, and then we will ask her what the current thinking is. But let's see what the audience thinks. So, how should that EU umbrella look like? Is sharing lessons enough? So, CER and other platforms will take care of it, or does Henriette have to put in something in the 10E revision, some EU principles, or even be more ambitious and to come up with EU implementation guidelines? So what do you think about that, dear participants? And you are many, so we're helping to do a small public consultation here. Okay, wow. So still some room for discussion. Ariette, what do you think about this?
It's interesting to see that so many are in favor of the EU umbrella for regulatory experimentation. And I think that this workshop feeds into our current thinking. I also want to mention that it is an important element that you cannot, via regulatory sandboxes and so on, deviate or derogate from rules set at EU level. Because at the national level, for instance, you cannot in a regulatory sandbox deviate from EU principles such as unbundling rules or EU network codes and guidelines. So today, therefore, a regulatory sandbox can only be established on areas with national competence. So, which limits the scope of the tool.
Yeah, thank you. And you open a very interesting topic, which we can ask to Neil, Luke, and Luca. To what extent are you constrained in your sandbox approach by EU rules? Luke, maybe this one you can come in first.
Well, actually, so far we didn't have any experiments that stumbled upon European legislation as being the barrier. So I don't think that necessarily would be the main problem. Or of course, we need to be aware of it for the future. But at this moment, I don't think it's a problem actually. I do, however, think that many NRAs would appreciate EU principles. So I agree with the SEER position. I think that if EU principles will be in place to allow for regulatory experimentation, then that can help in getting the proper innovations there. Personally, I don't see a need to go as far as having implementation guidelines. I think probably principles will be sufficient, and then look at it in each member state how it could be implemented there.
Thank you, Luke. Luca, what do you think about that?
Well, maybe all answers can be good, but in the right time horizon. Mm-hmm. In my view, nowadays, say for some years, we need learning lessons. So I see this as and maybe this is a first occasion, and I hope other occasions will follow. EU principles can, of course, be important, but remember that there are also national legislation that may somewhere, case by case, introduce constraints, and therefore we have to be conscious of these national constraints. For instance, in Italy, we do, I repeat, have the unique tariff distribution system for all the country, independently of DSO, independently of urban rural areas, and therefore this is an issue that maybe other countries don't have, can be a problem. That's what is important in my view is public consultation about ideas first before the decision, and dissemination of results for the players in the market, but also among us as regulators. And
thank you.
Here, of course, Florence School can play an important role.
Thank you, Luca. Neil.
Yeah, just quickly. So I think we did have one example recently of some European rules, which so I talked about wanting to expand the scope of our sandbox to include some of the industry codes. And I think one of the areas we ran up against some issues was in relation to the rules around balancing and settlement, where I think some harmonized rules, I think energy balancing guidelines were being introduced at the same time, which I suppose limited the ability to be flexible on a national level. But I think that's the only example that I've really come across. So there may be some potential to think about some of those harmonized rules and whether you need to create a degree of flexibility whilst not undermining the overall objective. Generally, we've found European rules to be sufficiently flexible. If anything, it's sometimes the national interpretation that the government's taken on things like universal service obligations, the way in which we've implemented that, that's where the problem lies. It's often at the national legislation level rather than at a European level.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I don't think we are that far apart on this one. Huh? So, Ariette, do you think we will see an article on regulatory sandboxes in the future 10E regulation, or am I jumping ahead of things?
You know that I'm not in a position to yeah.
Too early.
Process.
Where are you currently now in this process, Ariette?
Very shortly now we will have this online public consultation on the 10E revision, and also we will shortly have this inception impact assessment report published. So there, I encourage participation in the processes.
Okay, maybe we can even, Copenhagen and Florence, maybe that can even inspire us to do another of these roundtables. Okay, let's see what else we have in our Q&A box. I think we already addressed many of the questions. Some of them will take us back to some of the things we discussed at the beginning, which I think is fully okay. Let's see. Which one can we take? This one we already took. Yeah, so I see several people referring also to network codes. This comes close to what Neil was saying, right? The more we have these detailed network codes, and we are expecting even more of them in the future, the more maybe this could become an issue. But as far from what we heard from Luke and Luca, that has not yet been an issue for them. Okay, I don't know if anyone wants to comment further on that, on whether we need something specific related to network codes, which is a comment from Jochen I see here. Yeah, Neil, please.
Not specifically on network codes, but I think something we've been doing even before the sandbox experiment was really trying to look at regulation, particularly some of the consumer focused regulation, and try and remove detail where it wasn't needed and raise it up to a more principled level, such that it was easier to apply to different circumstances. And a lot of the innovations, the propositions we're seeing are fundamentally different to traditional energy supply. Yeah. And we found that a lot of the older regulation was really written with one sort of business model in mind, and that by actually trying to strip out that where possible, sometimes you absolutely do want to be very detailed and very specific, but where you don't need to be, just going at a more principled level has enabled more flexibility anyway. So I think that goes hand in hand with a sandbox, which then allows you to be flexible where there is a bit more detail.
Okay, thank you. Let me maybe read out a few of the questions, and then panelists can choose the one they prefer to pick up. So,
Luke, can I? Luca?
Yeah, sure, Luca, please.
Thank you. There is a question about public consultation at what stage?
Yes, please go.
Normally we do consultation before taking the decision on launching regulatory pilots or pilot projects. And this, for instance, is the case of the most recent gas pilot projects for sector integration. I want to mention another case that where a cross-sector integration at a distributed level, we launch a pilot project after consultation for sharing let's say the communication infrastructure needed for smart metering in the gas sector, together with other sectors even out of our jurisdiction. So water, waste collection that now are under our jurisdiction, but at the time were not, and also other kind of mobility services, of social service, public services in general. So we did these pilot projects. Recently, we produced the final report with all results, and then we made a second consultation on how to stabilize the result of such pilot projects. So how to put an ordinary rule, a regime rule for such a case of integration among different public services. And this was a very recent case. So there normally is a public consultation before, and if the results are good enough, there can be a second consultation afterwards.
Okay.
At the end, let's say, because this is the main message. Pilots are useful if you learn lessons and decide either to roll out or to incentivize somehow the results, or even to stop. For instance, in the storage case for TSO, that was many years ago. Then we decided not to expand such a case. Now, of course, storage can be owned only by market players, no longer by the TSO. This was a very initial stage, but was not prolonged, was not at all rolled out.
Okay, thank you, Luca. I'll just highlight 2-3 questions from the question box, and then everyone gets a final word in as a reaction. With the final word for Henriette, so she tells us, if she's happy with the roundtables and what is her main takeaway. So, but very quickly, you can still react to here. Are regulators using sandboxes to inspire them for future changes to the overall regulation? Yes or no? Christophe is then asking, why not involve Acer in this? Why only NRAs and ministries are responsible for these experiments? We already covered the transparency discussion, so we don't have to come back to that. Yeah, this one is also nice for you, Henriette. Katerina is saying, why not have a non-binding commission act, a communication or a working paper on this if you don't pick it up in the 10E regulation? And yeah, maybe that's it. So I'll let you just have your final word on this. Neil, Luke, Luca, and then Henriette. Very short. Neil, you're still muted.
All right, too many screens. I'd just say, I think, we're really pleased with the experiment we've done with sandboxes. I think no regrets there whatsoever. Absolutely, we've learned all the ways that we didn't do it right first time round, and really keen to try and improve that. But I think the benefits can't be measured just in the number of projects that have happened or have gone through to be launched in the market. It's the amount we've learned about what's happening in the market, changing the relationship between regulator and firms to have very different conversations, and the information we've got in terms of how we might need to change policy, change regulation going forward has been really, really valuable. So, in theory, in future, you wouldn't need a sandbox because you've created a regulatory framework that enables everything you want and doesn't allow everything you don't want. But that's, I'm not worried about doing myself out of a job in the short term, but I think that's a longer term aspiration.
Thank you, Neil. Luke, short comment.
Yes, yeah, thank you. So I agree with Neil on that. So we should take the lessons learned from every experiment, also with their impact on the regulation and legislation, of course. That's also, and that relates also to one of the other Q&As that was mentioned. That is also related to funding, for example, in the Netherlands, because it is also, well, because the ministry is involved, experimentation projects also can apply for subsidizing. Of course, one of the obligations that experiments within the regulatory sandboxes have is that they should show what they have learned from it, and that's, of course, I think, one of the quick wins that we do have, both at the national level, but also at the EU level. We should learn from each other as much as possible.
Thank you, Luke. Luca, short comment.
Very shortly about the European umbrella. Yes, of course, maybe Acer could be a place, although they only started to keep in touch with distributed issues or with even retail issues. Not yet even. So maybe I think that for the time being, we could think of think tank sites to exchange ideas and to propose new charts. Of course, ACER can participate. I'm totally in favor of that. But maybe they have such an overload by the new package that there are many other questions. We don't have time enough, but I'm fully available for direct contacts if needed.
And I'm also reminding everybody that you can continue the conversation using the hashtag on the slide here. But Henriette, you have the final word.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it's been a very interesting workshop, and it's very interesting to hear the experiences from the different tools and approaches. And I think it's also an important takeaway that some of you see EU principles and EU guidelines as a way forward. I mean, for us, sandboxes are an interesting regulatory tool, and at the moment we are reflecting on the possibility to introduce them in one way or another. Especially we have looked at this in relation to power to gas, as today we cannot deviate from EU level rules and to have them there. But most of all, this is feeds into our current thinking and to improve our legislation overall, not necessarily the 10E, but of course we are looking at the 10E now. So thank you for organizing this.
Thank you, Henriette. It has been a pleasure. And I want to thank the panelists, thank all the participants, and I'm sure we will do this again. So see you soon. Ciao, ciao.